All right.
All righty.
All right.
Hello
Ken,
to
you
all
go
of
ahead.
you.
Yeah.
Hello to all of you and welcome. Thanks for joining us today for a discussion on the anti-poverty legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Today's program is sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. I am Ken Clark, Director of OHR. We are fortunate today to be joined by three colleagues, two from Schenectady County and one from our own county who has been involved in initiatives to address poverty and other types of economic disparity. I will introduce them each momentarily. After this introduction, our panelists will speak, followed by your questions, which you can submit through the chat on YouTube. Many thanks to Rob Henry of the county's communications office, whose technical support is making this event possible. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we had commemorated earlier this week, was more than a civil rights leader. It is beyond doubt that his leadership played a key role in the passage of the three most significant civil rights laws in American history: the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was signed into law on April 11th, 1968, exactly 1 week after his assassination. He worked vigorously to ensure these legal rights were in place to enable African Americans and others to be American citizens in the most basic sense. To relegate Dr. King only to the role of civil rights, however, is to miss a significant part of his legacy. We would miss how he evolved to define the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s and other intersecting struggles, the anti-war movement and the anti-poverty movement, as part of what he called the human rights movement. Thomas Jackson, in his book From Civil Rights to Human Rights, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Struggle for Economic Justice, wrote that King referred to the American civil rights movement as one expression of an international human rights revolution that demanded economic rights to work, income, housing, and security. King's continuing evolution and radicalism was also reflected in his nationwide call for a Poor People's Campaign, a coalition of African Americans, poor whites, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans. This coalition would gather in Washington, D.C. in April 1968 to demand redress of their grievances by the United States government and to secure at least jobs and income for all. The campaign supported an economic bill of rights, calling for $30 billion in annual appropriations for a real war on poverty. As you know, Lyndon Johnson, who was president at the time, had launched a war on poverty in his first term elected as president in 1965. Congressional passage of full employment and guaranteed annual wage legislation was part of this economic bill of rights, and construction of 500,000 low-cost housing units annually until slums were eliminated. Massive nonviolent sit-ins were planned to shut down major traffic intersections in Washington and in the halls of Congress. These planned actions reflected Dr. King's demand in the last year of his life for America to undergo a revolution of values. As Michael Eric Dyson has written, this revolution of values reflected his belief that the fundamental institutions of American life must be made over in fairness to the poorest citizens. King's intentions corresponded with Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN General Assembly, the basis for human rights work, that people have the right to equal pay for equal work and to be paid as such to ensure an existence worthy of human dignity. They echo Article 23, that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. Unfortunately, the Poor People's Campaign did not fulfill its promise. Dr. King was assassinated in April, the month the campaign was to begin. In May of 1968, monsoon rains, mud, and heat in DC undermined the impact of the campaign. Many of you know that there is now a current Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, which nears its 5th anniversary of active engagement, May 14th to be exact, reflective of Dr. King's anti-poverty legacy. In cities and towns nationwide, anti-poverty efforts are being pursued. We have with us today 3 guests engaged in contemporary applications of Dr. King's anti-poverty work. Joining us today is Jamaica Miles, co-founder of All of Us, Untitled and Free in Schenectady, New York. Joanna Green, a member of the Tompkins County Human Rights Commission, the advisory board to our Human Rights Office, and a member of the Poor People's Campaign of the Eastern Southern Tier. And Arthur Butler, Executive Director of the Schenectady County Human Rights Commission. I will ask Jamaica to lead off by telling us about her work in addressing poverty.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so happy to be amongst such radicals in this room right here. Yes, my name is Jamaica Miles. I'm the co-founder of All of Us. And I mean, if we're talking about poverty in the work that I do, specifically in the city of Schenectady, but also extending beyond into the greater capital region, we can't talk about poverty if we're not talking about housing and the carceral state. Just like King had spoke about the need for housing as it relates to poverty and the need to end police brutality as it relates to poverty, that too is the work that we're doing with All of Us. Part of that work is about talking to and listening to people, right? The solutions that we need are not some aloof concept, but actually sit within those who are most impacted every single day. It was just over a year ago that we did a survey. It was called the Black Freedom Project survey that asked Black residents, what does it mean to have safe, healthy, and thriving communities? And the #1 answer was housing. We asked what policies need to be enacted as it relates to safe, healthy, and thriving communities. The #1 answer was jobs. So we see that throughout time, we are still facing many of the challenges that we were facing 50 years ago and beyond. And while there has been progress, let's not get it twisted. There has been progress, but we still have a long way to go. And we can keep talking about King over and over again because he too said that the fight was going to continue. It was not that the civil rights actions of his time were going to solve all problems, but that we had to continue the fight. And so that's part of the work that we do is how are we listening to the voices of impacted people? And from that, then moving forward to create the change that's necessary. As it relates to housing here in the city of Schenectady, the rent was too high before COVID hit. It was already a problem. And it was the first thing we were talking about before the uprising that happened and the impact of COVID that led us down the path of police brutality. And those two things are as connected as anything else. Because an individual that has an interaction with police very well can lose their housing. Because if someone is arrested and kept inside a jail for any amount of time, can't go to work, can't pay their bills, lose their housing, even if then they are later released, it compounds the issue. So we make sure that we work with individuals to ensure that they know their rights, that they're aware of some of the changes that have already happened, such as bail reform and discovery, that we continue to fight for because the backlash still exists, pushing back against the progress that we've made. And we also look for what are the local changes that can happen. Our city council actually has taken up the charge of looking at housing and saying, we know it's a problem. We know that the rent is too high for very many people. Over the last 30 years, we actually have seen a national increase in housing. But unfortunately, we've seen a decrease when it came to low income housing by close to 4 million units. So how is it that one, we are addressing the needs of the low income housing that's needed? Where can we create new housing? But also, we need to stabilize the rent problem that we have. And when I say rent stabilization, I mean rent stabilization, right? Ensuring that the property owners that have buildings in this city are not taking more than any of us can afford. In some of our poorest neighborhoods, we see rent that's $1,200, $1,300, $1,400 for a 1 or 2 bedroom, and individuals aren't making barely $15 an hour. So ensuring that we have laws and policies that counteract some of the greed that comes with capitalism every single day, and then continuing to push forward that fight against police brutality in the carceral state, and ensuring that our community members remain in our communities, that we are no longer trying to use cages to fix the ills of society, because too often that's what happens. That if there is a conflict with 2 neighbors, somebody thinks that one of their neighbors slashed their tires, they call 911, the police show up, and somebody's getting arrested, if not both people. 1, nobody's tire got fixed. And 2, you've removed those individuals from their community, from the economic base that they had, and increase the level of poverty. Because if that individual goes to jail, once they come home, the scarlet letter is not erased. And now they have a difficulty finding a job. They have a difficulty finding housing. They have limits on expanding their education. We push every single day to move away from incarceration as an answer to our social problems and look to invest in community, because the data is there. This isn't something that we're coming out of, no man's land, making stuff up. The research has been done for quite some time that when you put money into a community, that community reinvests in itself and becomes its own self-sustaining economic base. And the same is true with jobs. That if we invest in the opportunities for individuals that live locally, then they reinvest in those communities. My co-founder actually talks all the time, Sean Young, about there's been great development in the city of Schenectady, new buildings going up, whether it's in downtown or some of the neighborhoods, not all of them. Those construction workers don't live in our communities. They're making $30, $40 an hour, while our children and our neighbors walk by to the corner store with very little in their pocket. They take that money and they leave. So looking for additional pathways for local community members to receive the training so that when those jobs come to fruition for yet another project, that it's our local community that gets those jobs. And the same is true for the civil service exam. How is it that our city and our county can offer prep courses for the civil service exam? We do it for our students every single day. We say to students, we know you're going to take the SAT and the ACT, and we want you to know what that test is like before you take it so you have the best opportunity to do as well as possible. We very well can do the same thing when it comes to the civil service exams and target the most marginalized communities that we have. Again, this isn't something new. Under previous administration, there was a mayor that went and targeted a community and offered them incentives to come and buy buildings and to live in our community. So let's do that again. Let's go ahead and offer those types of incentives, whether it's home ownership, programs, career training, and be sure that we are giving those opportunities to the individuals who are in highest need. Equity is real. And if you just say, oh, well, that program exists, but you didn't go and tell nobody, well, then that program doesn't exist, which is another purpose that we serve in our communities, making sure that as often as possible, we share those resources with the people that could benefit from using it. And that's what we need to keep doing. We need to make sure that we are speaking to each other, not just about each other, that we are working collectively towards the betterment of everyone inside our communities and our society. And when we find a rhythm, when we find a solution that works, share that information. Don't silo it and be, I've got this, I figured it out, and my community is perfectly fine. Because for as long as there is capitalism and silos for as long as there's poverty anywhere. Anytime that individuals are able to be exploited, then you are one step away from being the exploited. So here in Schenectady and across the greater capital region, that's the work that we're doing with all of us. And I look forward to hearing the work that our colleagues are doing in other places as well.
Wow, Jamaica, that's exciting and impressive. And let me see if I can share my screen again. All righty. How is that? Yay. Okay, so I'm gonna I guess backtrack just a little bit and talk specifically about what I kind of see as the intellectual legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's anti-poverty thinking, and then and talk about how that is informing the modern day Poor People's Campaign that I've been involved with for the last 5 years, and then end with a little bit about how the challenges of playing that out on the ground in the local community of Tompkins County here. So let's see. I think kind of break it down into his legacy as a tremendous amount of clarity and the root causes of our problems today, the problem of poverty and many other interrelated problems. So clear diagnosis and a very clear vision of what is possible and a strategy for action. Those seem like simple things, but I think his thinking was path breaking, and it's still very, very accurate thinking in my mind, and provides kind of a map for those of us going forward. First of all, it's important, as I think Ken mentioned, that his thinking was becoming quite radical by those standards, and that he was really beginning to understand that the entire system that we live in, which is now a very global capitalist system, is designed not to produce the kinds of public goods that would eliminate poverty, but it's designed and built to benefit the few. And the way it does that is by dividing and exploiting the rest of us. So I love this little cartoon that pretty much says it all in a very simplified way. This is what our system is built to do. But that clarity, it's a very simple thought, but that clarity of thinking is continually clouded by the propaganda that we are fed by the system. So he was beginning to teach that the root causes of all these interlocking evils is the system itself: poverty, structural racism, militarism and the whole war economy, all the ecological devastation. That's sort of been a more recent reframing as well. And now the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. All of these things are intertwined. They are tools, and so to speak, of a system that is designed to keep the rest of us divided and keep us confused about what's going on and what the real problems are. So the insight being that none of these evils can really be confronted or overcome in isolation from the others. So Jamaica mentioned silos. Yeah, silos are part of the confusion. And his vision was, to understand that it doesn't need to be this way. This is not a natural state of being for human beings to live in such an unequal system. There's nothing natural about that. And here's just one of many beautiful quotes. I think it is necessary for us to realize that we have now moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. We see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power. In short, we have moved into an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. So he was becoming quite dangerous to the system because he was really beginning to clarify what needs to be done. And that was very, very threatening to the powers that be. So the strategy that he was beginning to lay out before, in the last year or so before his assassination, was what we call now a fusion strategy of emphasizing that all of those of us who are impacted by the system need to come together. It's not just about civil rights for Black people. It's that all of us are being, most of us, 99% of us are being exploited and oppressed by the system. So he talked about the poor and dispossessed. The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against this injustice, against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand. The solutions are at hand to lift the load of poverty. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national lives. So he was describing a strategy, a fusion strategy, which focuses on those who have the least to lose, those who know that they are being killed by the system, and the theory of change being that if those folks can be helped to become organized and to build their power, they will have the need and the momentum and the energy to be a transformative political force. So 50 years later, or thereabouts, in 2017, the campaign, Poor People's Campaign, was rebooted, and some of its features in this second go around. We have very strong national leadership, especially in the form of Reverends William Barber and Liz Theo Harris. They're a really dynamic team. They have started off in the last 5 years. They've done a whole really extensive research and analysis updated on the extent and nature of poverty in the United States. And they have really, one of the founding concepts that we talk about in Poor People's Campaign now is that we are now talking about over 140 million of poor, I hate the language, but poor and dispossessed, those folks who are technically poor, as well as those who are one paycheck away from being technically poor. But this is a terribly, the problem is growing. And in addition to this kind of analysis and clarity of what the problem is, they have, we, Poor People's Campaign, have put forward a really comprehensive and transformative policy agenda called the Third Reconstruction, or Demand for a Third Reconstruction. So it's a very visionary set of policies that would be really transformative for the economy and for people. And in addition to their showing the policy, policy vision, we have been doing mass demonstrations with nonviolent civil disobedience and a lot of media work and lobbying, that sort of thing. And there have been between 35 and 45 different active state Poor People's Campaigns, which have focused on more grassroots organizing and developing leadership. So the refurbished Poor People's Campaign has a little more specific strategy that we are trying to follow with three main tools. And the first, most fundamental, is building unity and leadership among what we call the poor and dispossessed. So we do a lot of leadership development work, a lot of studying of history, political education, trying to develop ourselves as clear, competent, committed, and connected leaders for a long-term movement. We do a lot of work trying to find and center the voices, lift up the voices of people who are most impacted, who are truly experiencing what it is like to live in poverty, and to undo some of the propaganda and the lies that are everywhere about poverty, and that it's poor people's own fault, et cetera, and to keep drawing attention to the system and the root causes of poverty. And then, of course, part of the strategy is influencing policies and elections. Knowing that elections and incremental policy change are not the end-all solution, but we need them to keep moving towards a more transformative change. Okay, just a quick one. In New York State, if you're not already involved in the Poor People's Campaign, there are a bunch of different regional groups. Here we have the Eastern Southern Tier. There is a really great Capital Region group. Are you guys connected to it? Anyway, okay, good. But I want to come back to, in terms of working on the ground in the local community of Tompkins County, the really central challenge that I see is this first one of building unity and leadership among the poor and dispossessed. Like how does that actually happen when so many people have kind of given up on the system? So many people don't vote, they don't feel that they have a voice, they don't see the point of becoming involved. So, you know, I think it involves understanding, helping ourselves understand and others understand the system and where we fit in. You know, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Developing our own leadership and helping those around us develop as leaders, especially those in our community who are most vulnerable, most impacted by policy violence. Connecting again across our differences of income, race, geography, rural, urban, etc. And then really helping everyone understand that this is a long-term struggle. This is not about a one little win. It's not about one election. It's not about one policy change. We are building a movement. So one thing that I know that I struggled with as a middle class person is like, where do I fit in something called the Poor People's Campaign? And I actually think that is a problem for a lot of people, the language that the Poor People's Campaign uses, unfortunately. But we do teach that the poor and dispossessed includes almost all of us. So it's taken me several years to learn that, oh, I understand that I am also being oppressed by the system, even though I'm doing pretty well, you know, that most of us are not really benefiting from the system. And as I said, well over 140 million people are really on the edge, not already poor. So we can see it in Ithaca, we can see that this is getting worse day by day. It's just visibly apparent, the extent of poverty and despair on the streets. Yet, as I mentioned, many of us don't. We've had a problem in the Eastern Southern Tier Poor People's Campaign in engaging different sorts of people for different reasons. One of them being that many people who are poor do not like that term. They see it as a stigma, and they, you know, and they, because of all the propaganda that being poor is your fault. Nobody wants to see themselves as being poor. On the other side, you have people like me who think of ourselves as middle class. So what are we doing in the Poor People's Campaign? But I just want to say, for any of those who like me are in the audience, do consider yourselves middle class. Part of what we teach is a history and sort of an analysis of class in the United States, and that the middle class has historically always been a bribed section of the poor and dispossessed, if you will. That the middle class has always been used by the controlling class to control and keep down the more dispossessed parts of the class. So here's a great quote: "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half," says Jay Gould and Robert Barron. But throughout history, that's been a principle that's been used by ruling class to maintain power. Okay, so, but these are all great ideas, but how do you actually do this work on the ground to start building a movement? And some of the challenges that we've faced in the Eastern Southern Tier are that the people that you most want to center in this work, the people who are most vulnerable, it's very hard to carve out time to go to a meeting or to be in planning actions and stuff. So how do we create opportunities for sustained engagement with people who just are struggling on the day-to-day needs? And I'd really love to hear from Jamaica and Arthur, maybe a little later in the program, how that works for you. Certainly those voices need to be centered and their leadership needs to be brought forward. There's also the people on the ground are often involved in these projects of survival, whether it's mutual aid, food distributions, of housing, tenants union, people dealing with their immediate problems. But how do you bridge the gap between those survival efforts and the larger vision of a movement building that needs to happen? That's the nut that we haven't been able to crack here. And then overcoming the silos between all those different struggles. So one of the latest things that I've been involved in through my participation in the Tompkins County Human Rights Commission is this new coalition that we're getting off the ground in Tompkins County. And after much discussion, I think we finally have a name, right, Ken? We're calling it Your Voice and Your Vote, the Tompkins Civic Engagement Coalition. So we've been meeting since July. I would say we're still in the forming stages of just sort of building unity among ourselves as community, as a diverse group of community leaders. We're not explicitly part of the Poor People's Campaign. Through my participation and others, the Poor People's Campaign is one of the partners, but we've got a lot of different partners on board. And we're asking the question, how can we increase civic engagement and help build power among those most impacted by policy violence within the Tompkins County community? And just asking that question is tremendously interesting to have people be discussing that. What does empowerment mean? How does that happen? People already have power. How does one help someone else gain power? Is power something that individuals hold, or is it something that happens collectively when they organize, et cetera, et cetera? So we're having great conversations. We agreed right from the get-go that this is way more than about voting or elections. We're not even sure that civic engagement is the right word, but it has something to do with building power. So we're in the process now of talking amongst ourselves, trying to craft our mission and understand each other. And we're exploring these great questions together. And we're really building unity amongst ourselves. And we're building our understanding of how our local system is working and what we can do. So I'll close with some more words from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Power for poor people will really mean having the ability, the togetherness, the assertiveness, and the aggressiveness to make the power structures of this nation, and our local communities, say yes when they may be desirous to say no. The end.
Okay. Thank you, Joanne.
Arthur, to you.
Thank you. So far this has, for me, been very insightful. We here in Schenectady at the Human Rights Commission, my role has been to look at what this office does and what we should be doing versus what we used to do. And sometimes we fall in the traps of doing what others have done and for some reason thought that was what we were supposed to do. But I guess I'm old enough to have been encouraged by teachers in elementary school, high school, and in college to do better, and be better. Dr. King encouraged us and challenged us to be the best that we could be, no matter what we were or thought who we were. So in listening to today's conversation, one of the things that I have done here is to look at the difference between equality and equity. Our speaker at our MLK Day observance on Sunday mentioned that equality, folks might think that is the fix-all, because if a bike is needed or a law is needed, we say, okay, that law will treat each person equally, that it protects us equally. Equity says that we must develop these things to meet people where they're at, so that if I have special needs, as Jamaica mentioned, if there are certain things that is needed in my community, that those things that we create creates a mechanism to meet us where we're at. This is difficult, right? Because folks saw those programs, such as affirmative action, and those kinds of programs that were created to make sure that people who look like me got into schools that, no matter what my grades were never going to allow me to get in. So folks saw it as something bad because these were quotas. That's what they thought. But really, it met the community where we're at and gave me an opportunity to something that, through racial and equity, didn't continue to create bad policies based on what was perceived as bad people. So we look at historical underpinnings, right? And so there's an article on how to be an anti-racist, book on anti-racism. And it says the history of racist ideas is the history of powerful policymakers erecting racist policies based on self-interest. Sounds familiar? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But as we get into the deeper dive, we see that it was based on self-interest, and not that the thought was that we were all created equally. It goes on to say that by then producing racist ideas, these ideas then defend and rationalize the inequitable effects of their policies. Basically, we can rationalize things away. We can make it sound like, well, we created the program, and we hear this all the time. Well, I speak in the eye. I hear this all the time. We have the job, we just aren't getting enough qualified people. But then people like Jamaica and I ask the questions, well, where are you sending out your notices? Where are you reaching into? Are you going into community? Or are you just sending it to people who look like you, who are protecting that social middle class ideology? Are you sending it to them to say, well, we did our due diligence by at least having the job description, but because we didn't find anybody, we gave it to the husband of our best friend. And so then we find ourselves in situations where the person at the top is related somehow to the person second in command, to the person who is at the reception, to the HR director, a whole system. So we're talking about systems. Meanwhile, everyday people consume, take in those racist ideas. And we've seen this only come to a tipping point in the last administration, where those ideas, right? Those ideas then spark ignorance and hate. So to look at the whole picture, the struggle has been going on since the first slave ship came to this continent. And it continues, right? Those 4 laws that Ken, you talked about, those 4 important laws, were important in theory. But when it came to the application of those laws, they were chiseled away by those in power because of their self-interest. We give credit to LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, for signing off some, but he also signed away a lot because he had to appease those Southern colleagues, which he himself was from Texas, but he had to make sure that their interests were protected. So when we talk about things like the underpinnings, critical race theory, right, which really is an intellectual approach to looking at how the United States belief system is based on racism, and is at the core of its laws and institutions. And that's frightening when you ask people to look in the mirror and describe what they see. Because most folks will say, oh, I'm not a racist. Oh, I'm not this. Oh, I've done this. I know some good Black people. My best friend is Black. But when we want to weaponize our interests, we will go against what we know and link to what we've done. So that gets the police called on the Black neighbor quicker than the white neighbor, or the call where Jane Doe doesn't think that the Black man walking his dog should be walking in the same park, breathing the same air, utilizing the same systems as her. So equity, that's really been my, even here on the county level, is to look at whether or not we are providing enough support to meet people where they're at. So those civil servant exams is create those classes free of charge, and to provide them out in the community with educators or people who can walk them through those tests in a way that is patient and that is loving, right? Because Dr. King in his blueprint to life said that there needs to be a commitment to the external principles. And he said those principles were love, beauty, and justice. So how do we challenge ourselves to move behind conversation? Because I know for me, at some point, I'm just tired of talking. I'm tired of educating. Derek Bell, who is the father of the critical race theory, said, my greatest fear is that we have come so far, but yet nothing has changed. In my lifetime, I can own that comment where I thought that the things that my grandmother and that my mother fought so hard for, that I'm still fighting the same fight that they fought. And I'll shut up there because I really want to hear what other people have to say in terms of what level of commitment they can agree to help bring about change. Can they be in their position on the job? Can they hire people? Can they give people chances? Those kind of things. Lastly, let me just say this. And I promise I'll stand up, right? When I went to the county manager and then the county legislators, I asked for a position that was taken away from this office. And I wouldn't have known that because I didn't have the historical knowledge. But in looking at an old budget, I said, wait, there was more than just me at one time. What happened to that? So I went and I asked a question, but I had to have a sales pitch to get that position back. And then the next thing I did is I talked to HR. And I said, I'd like to make this position non-civil servant. Because that opens the opportunities. That's the equity behind the decision in utilizing my role as executive director. By making it non-civil servant, then people will have a fair shot, a fair chance at the position that, based on civil servant exams, who scored the highest, who's next in line, who's the friend of the friend of the friend, all that stuff gets wiped out. That's equity. That for me is leveling the playing field. So thank you. And
Okay. Thank you all, you three, so much for your presentations. I wanted to, I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but what I would like to do, I mean, there were several things that each of you said that really kind of struck me or made me curious in terms of inquiry. And, I was thinking about what you said, Arthur, about how, for instance, in talking about LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th president, that he did a great deal of good. I mean, in terms of he was the person who signed those three major pieces of legislation, voting rights, civil rights, and fair housing. But on the other hand, you hear Dr. King in his Riverside speech, the Riverside Church speech he gave, which was his most thoroughgoing criticism of America's involvement in Vietnam. He talked about how so much money was being siphoned off of the war on poverty, which was one of his signature programs, and was going toward the war effort. And that this was something that he could not stay silent on, because he also saw that war, going to the heart of our discussion, as a war on the poor, and saying that, you had soldiers fighting side by side and dying with each other, and yet they could not live next to each other in Detroit or in Jordan. And so, I mean, we see how that's sort of emblematic of the way in which we see these sort of political machinations and games played. And how, the question is, how do we, how do we change that? How do we change that? How do we, particularly in our own backyards?
I'm gonna jump in. Because there's a couple different pieces to that. While we should always acknowledge the progress that we've made, we also need to be mindful to have the knowledge of what was in the legislation that was passed. And I'm only going to talk about the Civil Rights Act at this particular moment, because it damned the South and gave a gateway to the North. The language specifically said, oh, well, in the South, we know that the segregation is intentional, but in the North, it's just happenstance. And so created and supported a system of segregation in the North that perpetuates today. So while there was the Civil Rights Act that was indeed monumental and important, New York State is the most segregated state in the nation. Let us not forget that. And when we're looking at how the war on poverty is connected to militarism, let's remember capitalism. There is big business in bombing Baghdad, but not Boston, right? They make money from all of those jets and those bombs that predominantly are causing harm and murdering Black and brown folks in other countries. And when it came to the Vietnam War, it was Black bodies that were used to kill other people of color, and that it was our family that didn't come home.
Mhm.
that they were the ones put on the front lines. I actually, one of my late brothers was one of those draft individuals who was drafted, and his number was something like 15. And it was one of 2 times that they re-pulled the numbers because of the outcry of the people saying, you're putting Black people on the front lines on purpose. You're killing us for your war that serves us no good. We're coming home in body bags. And so he ended up being, let's say, fortunate enough to end up with a number that was so far off that he ended up not being drafted. That didn't happen for everybody. But that war was a profit for some people.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so when they're saying, we have to protect the United States, we must protect, we must have a military presence in all of these places, we need to question who truly is profiting from those wars, as opposed to the investment that could go directly to the people. And that is something that Martin spoke directly about. We don't need to beat around the bush and look for different ways to give people money. He wanted a direct universal wage,
Mhm. Mhm.
a universal income. Take out the middleman. Give it directly to the people for them to be able to provide for themselves and their families. And again, that money then goes back into the economy. When people have money, they spend money.
Mhm.
So when we're thinking about the idea of the militarism and the Vietnam War specifically, and the wars we still engage in right now, because let's not get it twisted, the United States still is in the business of killing people in other places. And it is not just the bad guy. There are women and children who die every single day in countries that have been bombed by the US. But people don't want to talk about that. And as a matter of fact, I expect there to be a meme about me after this conversation. But that is money that was prioritized to the profit of those few companies instead of investing directly in people, whether it's education or housing. Those are choices. And to change it, which was the original question, having conversations like this,
Mhm.
educating community members for them to be aware that decisions are made in their name, but not in their best interest.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then organizing those folks to demand change, because change never happens because it's supposed to. It only happens when it's demanded.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, There's one question that's come to us. Should police be a civil service job with age limit dropped?
I want to hear from Arthur or Joanna as well. But here's the thing. In my humble opinion of doing this work for quite some time now, let us remember that the police are state sanctioned officers. They are law enforcement. So the facade of them being a unionized workforce, I don't know that our question is about whether or not they are a civil service exam and what limits there need to be on entering the police force. A better question is, why are we not limiting the police force? Again, it's a police force. They use force to control, to physically remove bodies. They are indeed an act of violence. That is what they're taught, how to violently intervene when there is a situation. They are often the escalator, not the de-escalation of a situation. And King, since that's who we're talking about, don't take it up with me, take it up with MLK. He's the one that said, police brutality is a problem, we need to be done with it. So let us ask questions that are going to get us to a place that is better for everyone. Because while we are disproportionately impacted as Black folks every single day by police brutality, poor white folks are getting their heads cracked as well. And so instead of us looking to nitpick or make decisions, is this a civil service? Policing didn't start off as a public good. It was a private institution that businesses lobbied to become a public good so that they didn't have to pay for the private security. So let's just change the whole system to be better for all people.
I could add to
Joanne?
that. I could add to that, Jamaica, from where I sit. I think one of the whole criminal justice system, police reform or abolition, that whole ball of wax is a great example of how we get twisted, as you say, when we don't think of the problems on a systemic level. When we just take, okay, the system is a given, and how do we deal with these byproducts of community violence and you know, but you will never solve that problem with the basic underlying structures of power and economic injustice are in place. In order to create a system that is truly abolitionist, where police are not necessary, there has to be such a massive redistribution of economic and political power that so yes, it's a very, very broken system, where it's a system that's designed. I mean, the whole police, the institution of police is designed into the system from our foundation, from this, you know, days of slave catchers, et cetera. So, but it's a teachable moment when we say, like, look, we have to look at, I think those of us who have been in these discussions sort of recognize the systemic problems and see that there has to be a total radical transformation. So we understand, we can talk about defunding the police, we can talk about abolition, we have in mind a long-term vision, but when other people hear us use these words, they think, well, what are you talking about? This is, you know, there's crime, they don't see in terms of transformation. They want an immediate solution. So I think it's a terrible set of problems, but it's an opportunity for us to keep talking about the broken system that doesn't serve the public good.
Because we're talking about the system, not the people. This isn't a conversation about, oh, I know a good cop who's never done bad things in my community. He works for a system and an institution that was created, has a foundation in harm and violence. We're talking about changing systems and structures. And Joanna, I'd be happy to talk to you offline about some of the solutions, about what it looks like to think differently about how people interact with each other when there is conflict and need for a resolution.
Hey, Arthur, anything to add?
I think Jamaica summed it up. We're talking about systems, systemic ideals and practices that were put into place to protect the self-interest of a few. They're still in effect, they're still happening, they're still going on. And you know, we have to look at the systems. When we look at the systems, then change will start to happen. But we gotta make sure that it's equitable, and that we're meeting each other at the place that we need to be met at. To look at those systems first is just to admit it. You know, in the 12-step program, they said first step is to admit that you have a problem.
I think
that is apparently very difficult for some people in power to manage. But go ahead, Ken.
I think this, what you say about systems and institutions is so so right on. I mean, because in many cases there's been a conditioning in this culture to look at things from the individualistic level, and not to look at things as being the products of systems or structures, or as my Christian ethics professor in divinity school who taught Dr. King used to say structure relationships. And we have seen how that has indeed happened. And it's, the question and the challenge, and I think it's part and parcel of the reality of protracted struggle, is how do we over time help people to understand what they're really up against, what is affecting them. There's a question that came in from County Legislator Veronica Pillar, who is a liaison between the legislature and our Human Rights Commission, our advisory group, of which Joanna is a part. She asked this question: a lot of organizing happens through organizations, and it's hard to imagine the whole poor/working class joining one org. How do we practically build the magnitude of systemic change? And right on time, Veronica, Dr. King spoke of.
Well, nobody's surprised that I'm really excited about answering this question. It is not any one organization. It is not any one group. It's all of us. Shameless plug. Because there are so many people and there are so many problems, and because what we are facing comes at us in so many different directions, it is necessary for us to have multiple groups with different ideas and different vantage points and different missions and visions, as long as we are all heading towards the promised land of justice and equity and freedom and liberation. Then you find the organization that fits with your ideals and is willing to work with you based on your skills, knowledge, and information. Because not everybody thinks I'm a wonderful person, and not everybody gets along with me, and that's okay. Because if you want to do the work, you find a way to do the work. You find an organization to do the work with, or novel idea, start your own group. I did, right? But you find a way. And for organizations that are doing the work, if you feel that you have the same 5 or 6, 7 people showing up all the time, you need to change too. It is necessary for us to operate from a space that we are always examining ourselves and ensuring that we are open and welcoming, that we are breaking down barriers, that there is some type of family-friendly environment. If it does not include childcare, how are you ensuring that families with children can participate? That there is transportation, that there is food, that you are coordinating around other people's schedules, and that you are not saying no for somebody else. Oh, well, I know this person can't do it because, they work 2 jobs and they got 3 kids and they're trying to go to school. Well, guess what? It's not your decision to decide whether or not somebody else can do something, will do something, wants to do something, or won't do something. So being accessible and then looking for an access point, right? It is from both sides. It is completely possible. And it's not just the vision of MLK. There are plenty of other folks. Malcolm, also on my wall, is another individual that looked for those unity moments and how are we working collectively. The Black Panther Party was not just Black folks by themselves, but they were working with white Appalachians and Latinos and other poor whites to come together because there is a common cause. So we actually have history that shows us how to do the work, but we have to have the commitment and put the effort in to get it done. And there needs to be enough of us, because when one of us gets tired, we do need to take a break. But it's okay that you take a break, because there's 10, 15, 20 people behind you that they're going to carry the load while you rest. And then when one of them needs to take a break, you pick it back up again and you carry the load forward. So it's that we keep doing the work. It took us 30 years to get our schools fully funded, because we wouldn't stop. So just don't stop and keep talking to each other and let other folks know what opportunities there are, and we'll get it done. There, solved
it. Joanne, off anything to add to this?
Not really much to add to what Jamaica said, but yeah, the movement, the Poor People's Campaign, is not the be-all and end-all organization, but we are a move. We're all part of a movement. We've just got to make these cross connections. We've got to keep, developing our own leadership, studying history, helping other people know history. Yeah, it's and knowing that for a lot of white folks, I think it's a lesson we have to learn that, we don't get what we want right away. This is a struggle that other people have been in for generations, and we have to learn. I'm not saying learn patience. I'm not saying wait, but be committed for the long haul, because the struggle's not going to go away. You're gonna, any forward movement, the powers that be are going to fight back, and so we've got to keep building. We can't lose faith, but we can't lose our militancy either. I think we're on the cusp. I like to think we're on the cusp of bigger steps forward, because there's a generational change. There's a generational shift underway. And I think that young people, the older generation like me, we're holding back a lot of change that needs to happen. And I like to think that younger folks are going to make the work easier. But in the meantime, it's really hard, because the powers are deeply entrenched. There's huge propaganda against this kind of understanding of the systemic nature of the problem. And people are just fed lies on a daily basis about how the system works. So, but forward together, not one step back.
Yes. And on that note, I think we will close. I want to thank all of you, Jamaica, Joanna, Arthur, for just an excellent discussion and interaction. As we reflected on Dr. King's anti-poverty legacy, and we also see the interconnections between all sorts of things through this discussion. And we will have to do an encore of this to be continued on this bringing the three of you together again at some point in time. But I want to thank you all, and I want to thank our audience for being with us and for the questions that you raised, and really appreciate your time as well. So again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time. Take care. Okay. Rob, are we off?